filing proxy season. My name is LizAnn Eisen, and I'm an acting professor of the practice at Cornell Tech and Cornell Law School. I also have the pleasure of being the faculty director for the Cornell Board of Directors Forum at Cornell Tech in New York City. This year's board forum will take place on March 26th and 27th at the Roosevelt Island campus at Cornell Tech. There's more information on our Board of Directors forum in the chat. I'm going to apologize now. We've just lost power, and so I look a little in the shadows. Well, hopefully the power will return soon. Today, we're culminating our series of eCornell discussions on topics that are at the forefront for those who are working in business, especially with public companies and almost public companies. Given the time of year, so-called proxy season is almost upon us. What is proxy season? It is the 3-month or so period during the year in the spring when most public companies hold their annual shareholder meetings. It is the time of the most intense engagement with all shareholders. Companies are required to prepare information for their investors, such as financial statements, information about senior executive compensation, succession planning, and other governance matters. It is the time of year when shareholders provide formal feedback to the company and board about topics of both interest and concern to them. Today, we're going to talk about some of the key things that shareholders have said that they want to hear about from companies, including ESG matters, shorthand for environmental, social, and governance, union activity, AI, cybersecurity, and if we have time, physical security. We are lucky today to be joined by 2 experts in this area, Kelley and Leah Malone, both partners at Simpson Thacher Bartlett, a leading top global law firm. Karen is the head of Simpson Thacher's public company advisory practice, and she regularly assists public companies and their boards on navigating a wide range of matters, including SEC and stock exchange reporting and disclosure requirements, disclosure of board and executive compensation, corporate governance, conflicts of interest, crisis management planning, shareholder proposals, director independence, insider trading considerations, the impact of proxy advisory firms, and responses to formal and informal SEC inquiries. In particular, she regularly advises boards of directors and committees regarding board and committee structures, new developments and changing best practices in governance, sensitive management and board leadership transitions, and board and committee self-assessments. Her partner, Leah Malone, heads the Simpson Thacher's sustainability and environmental, social, and governance practice. Leah advises boards, management teams, and investors on sustainability and ESG matters from conception through strategic implementation, oversight, and reporting. Her work includes issues related to shareholder engagement, shareholder activism, board effectiveness, board compensation, and DEI and other employee initiatives, as well as reporting and disclosure, green initiatives, and risk and crisis management, among other areas. I want to say thank you to both of them for joining us today. We are lucky to have people with such expertise to spend an hour with us talking about this important topic. Before we jump in, a little background. As background, Rule 14A8 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 provides a framework for allowing a public company shareholder to request that a proposal be included in the company's proxy statement to be voted upon at the company's shareholder meeting. While Rule 14A8 provides a means for shareholders to propose changes to a company's governance practices, among other things, it can also be a source of controversy, particularly when the proposals that a shareholder is making deviate from the preferences of the board of directors and potentially other shareholders. In addition to procedural requirements that often allow for excluding shareholder proposals, the company has the ability to exclude shareholder proposals under certain other circumstances. When they do so, a company will often engage with the Securities and Exchange Commission to seek a no action letter, which essentially says that the SEC staff will not recommend enforcement action against the company for excluding a particular proposal. There has been a steady increase of submissions of shareholder proposals pursuant to Rule 14A8 over the past 5 years. And 2024 continued this trend with over 700 proposals submitted to companies included in the Russell 3000. That said, median support has steadily declined each year over the past 4 years, with median support for 2024 proposals just over 20%, the lowest level in 5 years. Karen and Leah, can you speak to your experience this past proxy season and what may be on the horizon for 2025?
Sure, and I'll start on my end, and thank you, LizAnn, for the kind invitation to join the panel today. From my perspective, there are some consistent themes in terms of the 2024 proxy season. One was that the typical targets remained large cap companies that are often in the news. Those seem to be the typical targets of shareholder proponents who are looking to submit these proposals. Some of the rise, as you referenced, in terms of the number of proposals can be attributed to the increase in anti-ESG proposals. I think we're going to see some more of that this year, but there was an uptick last year that did contribute to the overall volume of proposals. In addition, what was interesting about the 2024 proxy season was that there was an uptick in governance proposals as well. In the years leading up to 24, there had been a dip, but there was a resurgence, including with respect to proposals that were a little bit newer on the horizon. For instance, the Carpenters Union submitted a number of proposals that requested companies enhance their director resignation provisions. These proposals were very interesting in the sense that they asked for bylaw amendments that would force the effectiveness of a director's resignation to the extent the director failed to receive a majority vote. As you mentioned, there's this laborious no action letter process potentially that sometimes companies can use. And through this process, the SEC was actually the SEC did capitulate and allow companies to essentially exclude a number of these proposals on substantive grounds. In this case, a lot of state law issues were raised by virtue of these bylaw amendments. And so the SEC staff did concede that a lot of them, if these proposals were implemented, they would actually cause a company to violate state law. And so those were excluded. But we also know that this is not the end. And these proposals are coming across in a different variation for this upcoming proxy season. The other thing I would just note in response to your question is kind of the decline in support. You referenced that the support has dropped. At the same time, the volume has increased. And in terms of the decline, I think it's really explained by a number of different factors. I think number one, the proposals now that we're getting, or our clients and our companies are getting, are very prescriptive. You know, a number of years ago, they'd be very loose. There'd be a lot of discretion being given and afforded to management and the board in terms of how to implement the proposals. Nowadays, the proposals are very specific in terms of timing, in terms of what they want to get done. And so accordingly, investors and shareholders are reacting to the prescriptive nature of the proposals and kind of thinking twice about whether to support. The second factor that I think is important to note is how proactive companies are being in terms of engagement with shareholders. It is a year-round exercise now. Folks are pounding the pavement, talking to their investors, and especially in light of proposals, we are seeing companies that are engaging specifically on the proposals themselves. And so that may be attributing to part of the reason why the decline in shareholder support. The last factor I wanted to reference was kind of the shift that you're seeing on the part of institutional investors themselves. They're also changing their approach by being much more selective in terms of the type of shareholder proposals they're going to support. So with that, I'll turn it back to you all.
Thank you, Karen. And I do want to say, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. We will be happy to answer any questions from those in the audience. As we turn, thanks, Karen, for that explanation. Let's dig a little bit deeper into each of the E, the S, and the G that I mentioned. Leah, what are your thoughts on how environmental proposals have fared in recent years? and their prospects in the upcoming proxy season?
Yeah, thanks, LizAnn, and massive kudos to you for managing this so well in the midst of a power outage. This is a first for me on a webinar, but I'm very impressed with how you're managing. So when it comes to the environmental proposals this year, I mean, typically the story of ESG during proxy season has taken a pretty distinct shift in the last 2 years, I would say. There were, 5 years ago, ESG was having its moment during proxy season. It was the time when proponents in this area were feeling the greatest success. They were really seeing companies embrace some of the ESG related topics in the shareholder proposals. They were changing their practices as a result. They were engaging on these issues. Companies were really kind of embracing this idea of doing more voluntary reporting, providing information to shareholders that they were asking for, whether around climate or other issues. The world is looking quite different today than it did in 2021, 2022, when support for shareholder proposals around ESG issues was relatively high. Last year in the 2024 proxy season, we only saw 2 environmental-based shareholder proposals receive majority support. That was a massive drop-off from a couple of years prior. I wouldn't be surprised if we see similar numbers this year along environmental lines. In particular, some of the other kind of factors in the background here that are shifting practices are, in addition to the items that Karen mentioned in terms of the proposals being much more specific, prescriptive, the quality of the proposals has kind of changed. In part in a reaction to company practices changing. So again, 5 years ago, most companies were not doing a lot of voluntary reporting on things like their greenhouse gas emissions, their water, their waste, topics that for many large cap public companies, they have really made that process of reporting much more sophisticated. They're offering much more voluntary reporting that's available to investors. So, the things that investors need to ask for, that list has shifted, has become shorter, and to Karen's point, more specific. So now the proposals that we do see around environmental issues for this year are relating in part to that. And there's also a recognition that for especially large public companies, but for medium-sized public companies as well, there's new not voluntary required reporting that is coming into place that will really shift the idea of sustainability-based reporting for companies. This is coming from kind of 2 main directions at the moment. California has new climate reporting laws that are in effect. They will cover this year, 2025. Reports will be made available early next year in 2026. And this will cover companies' emissions, scope 1, 2 in the first instance, and then scope 3 will be included a year later. This is required reporting for all public and private companies that have over $1 billion in annual revenue. They'll have to make this information available. They'll also have to do TCFD reporting, which is a report on how the company manages climate-based risk internally. So that's having a big effect here in terms of the issue here isn't all about voluntary reporting anymore. This is starting to be required. There are also requirements coming out of the EU, a large regulatory regime called CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is requiring companies that have a substantial foothold in the EU, including US-based companies that have operations in the EU, to offer mandatory reporting on a variety of sustainability topics, including climate, but many other topics as well, under this new reporting regime. Most US-based companies that will be in scope of this law will start to come into scope this year. Again, similar timing to the California laws, with reporting due early next year. So from the investor position, if you're looking at the companies in your portfolio, the biggest companies are going to be offering a lot of this information that you were asking for a couple of years ago under a mandatory regime. There's no need to keep banging the drum and asking them to do this on a voluntary basis. So that's shifting the background here as well. We are continuing to see environmental-based proposals this year. I would say the number is probably dropping off a little bit, but we do continue to see proposals around climate reporting, for example, on how will you be achieving the goals that the company set a couple of years ago. 2030 is right around the corner. And so some of the proposals go to specific issues like that. Please offer reporting on where you are against those goals. We do continue to see proposals around carbon emissions reporting scope 1, 2, and adding companies asking companies to add scope 3 reporting. We also see more proposals this year on topics like packaging, single-use plastics, the use of recyclable packaging for consumers, new topics like critical minerals, asking companies to commit not to do kind of deep sea critical mineral mining. And then we're also seeing some proposals relating to the types of investment options that companies make available to their employees through their 401k plan. So still a variety of kind of environmentally based proposals. I would not be terribly surprised to see levels of support for these proposals to be at the relatively low levels that we saw last year.
Thanks, Leah. We've had a question from the audience about this sort of declining support and the sort of drop. What what do you attribute that to? It sort of flies in the face that investors have had to ask for less because companies are providing more information. So why the continued declining support? What do you, or Karen, if you have thoughts, what do you all think about that?
Well, and I would throw in two additional factors. I think, the points about the quality of the proposals, the prescriptiveness of the proposals, that is having a huge impact here. And the general topics covered, they just tend to be much more specific than they have in the past, in the first couple of years of rounds here. There's also two other themes that I don't think we can ignore. One is a very obvious anti-ESG push in the United States, both politically, but a great deal of sensitivity from companies and investors around the idea that this is not something everyone is behind anymore. And investors have started to change their voting policies when it comes to support for climate-based proposals and other environmental proposals as well. Taking a much finer look at what exactly is this proposal asking for? Is it appropriate for this specific company in its circumstances? And then another factor I might throw in is the rise of proxy choice for the large institutional investors. They, for the most part, have started to adopt proxy choice policies where they're allowing the ultimate holders to exercise a greater degree of judgment around how their votes should be cast. And this is in part a way to kind of distance the investment manager from making all of those voting decisions on behalf of the ultimate owners and allowing those ultimate owners to, in some instances, exercise their own judgment or follow a different voting policy than, a BlackRock or a Vanguard or a Fidelity might have in place.
And just to jump on what Leah said, I think I mentioned it earlier, but, just double downing on the investment on the advisors themselves and managers. I mean, obviously their voting policies have changed over time dramatically as well. And so a couple of years back, they're much more keen to support these types of proposals, especially on the environmental side. And I think that they are themselves now become very much the subject of anti-ESG sentiment and other initiatives. And so by virtue of themselves changing their policies, that's had a tremendous impact on voting just because of the percentage of outstanding shares that are actually held by these large managers. Any sort of shift in terms of policy will make a tremendous difference in terms of voting.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Leah. That's a perfect segue into our next question, and our next topic, which is moving into the S part of the ESG, and in particular, DEI matters. How is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, affecting proxy season?
Gosh, DEI is everywhere. Everything everywhere all at once at the moment, and it's dominating conversations in a number of realms. It's certainly playing out in proxy season along with a variety of other circumstances. So again, pretty dramatic shift in the DEI space from 2020 in the aftermath of George Floyd, the stances that companies were taking really proactively to try to embrace, serious concerns about racial justice, adopt new diversity programs. really kind of trumpeting their efforts around that. In connection with, in some cases, shareholder proposals or, push from large institutional investors asking companies to be a little bit more forthright about the actions that they're taking in those areas. We've seen massive pushback, obviously, against DEI efforts at corporations, and it's flowing through proxy season as well. In the past couple of months, there's been a couple of activists, in particular, Robbie Starbuck is one who's gotten a great deal of attention for launching kind of PR campaigns against a number of very large, especially consumer-facing companies, really targeting the DEI programs that they had in place, looking very much to company disclosure in 10Ks and proxy statements on company websites, and pointing to programs and policies that were in place that this activist kind of found objectionable and argued were not in alignment with recent Supreme Court jurisprudence. So asking those companies to make changes to their DEI related policies, including supplier diversity policies, employee training, a number of areas. Lots and lots of media attention around this as a result, and we've seen many of those large, again, typically large consumer facing companies for the most part, make fairly significant changes to their DEI programs. This is, you see it in the headlines as massive rollback. The extent to which the companies are changing their programs varies quite a bit under different circumstances, but we are certainly seeing pretty particular pullback from many of those companies. Not all, and Costco in particular was in the news a week or two ago for really pushing back against that effort and saying, look, this is something that's a part of our corporate strategy. We stand behind it. They recently at their shareholder meeting, so they're very early in the process in terms of their shareholder meeting taking place in January. So we get to see kind of an insight into how this might play out for some other companies later during the year as we roll into kind of the real annual meeting season in April and May. But at Costco, they did actually have a shareholder proposal around this topic, specifically asking them, a conservative group had filed a proposal seeking for the company to evaluate the risks that its DEI program might pose to the company. The proposal did not pass. It received less than 2% support, I believe, from shareholders. And so I think from a management perspective, Costco probably looked at that and said, look, the positions that we've taken have been sort of borne out by shareholder input on this topic. I will just note that within a week of that vote, a group of 19 attorneys general from a variety of states sent a letter to the Costco CEO asking them to repeal their DEI policies, alleging that they were in violation of employment law and other anti-discrimination laws, and asking them to respond within 30 days of either telling them that the DEI policies had been repealed or explaining why they had not. So that's kind of an early indication of how this might play out at some companies. On the flip side, for those companies that have really rolled back their DEI programs, we're also seeing proposals from investors who come at this from a different viewpoint, asking those companies to report on the benefit that those DEI programs had in place before they were kind of discontinued or revised. So sort of pushing the alternate viewpoint here of what's the value that you're leaving on the table by changing those programs now. So a very highly politicized topic at the moment that is playing out in any number of ways, but certainly within the shareholder proposal process as well.
Thanks, Leah. It's certainly something to keep our eye on. It seems you can't pick up or read the news without seeing something about this topic right now. 2024 also reflected a pronounced rise in union activity related to issuers. For example, Starbucks and Warrior Met Coal. Can you talk a little bit about some of those developments?
Sure, and I'm happy to take that one. So you are absolutely correct that there was this rise in union activity during 2024, and it was on a couple of different fronts, all surrounding the annual meeting process. First off, unions did use 14A8, the rule that you referenced earlier, to submit traditional proposals, and so that was definitely on the rise. I think the number was they increased 200% from the prior year, so it was definitely a pronounced rise. In addition, I think what's interesting to note was like different strategies that were being employed by unions in terms of getting through or pushing through their strategies. So one, as you mentioned, was Starbucks. And at Starbucks, there was actually a proxy fight that was initiated by the Strategic Organizing Center. It's a coalition of labor unions to nominate 3 director candidates to the company's board. The focus of this director nomination was the company's perceived failure to oversee human capital management and to resolve labor rights issues. And so that was the thrust or the reason and rationale behind the nomination of these directors. Ultimately, this group relented, they withdrew, but not before Starbucks actually engaged with the company, or sorry, with the union groups. And ultimately, there was a framework to establish collective bargaining agreements as a result of all of this engagement. So it's a little bit of a, a head fake there, but the reality was that this was in some ways quite a win on the part of the Strategic Organizing Center. You also referenced Warrior Met Coal. In that case, it was not a traditional proxy fight to get board seats, but in fact, they used the process or like the processes that exist to put in certain proposals for shareholder approval. In this case, they didn't use the 14A process. They used kind of the bylaw provisions the company had in place. And they actually submitted 5 different proposals for shareholders to vote across. They covered poison pill, proxy access, blank check preferred stock, golden parachute severance agreements, and human rights assessments. And so through this floor proposal process, they were actually successful in pushing across 2 of those proposals, which, not entirely clear that they were really the main focus of these labor groups, but the idea here was that it definitely gave them ammunition in terms of broader negotiations with the company, that they had this firepower to be able to bring across these floor proposals. This same type of strategy was also used as News Corp. In that case, the proposal at hand was to collapse News Corp's dual class structure. So these are all kind of variations of a theme that were unusual and not really used prior to this year, at least in any sort of full force. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether there's similar types of engagement for this upcoming 2025 proxy season. In addition, another strategy that the labor unions did use alongside other shareholders was the exempt solicitation process. Not to get too far into the weeds about this, but it is an SEC rule that has been leveraged by folks to basically upload and to provide soliciting material more broadly to, assert a certain position with respect to proposals that are being brought to a vote. And so under the rule itself, if you own a certain amount of shares and you're soliciting investors to engage on a vote, then you're obligated to make the filing. Nowadays, a lot of other folks that do not have the requisite number are putting on these voluntary filings. And the way these filings work with the SEC is that they are actually pushed out alongside the company's other normal traditional 10K, 10Q, 8K filings. And so you can't really tell the difference between the two. So it's been actually a very effective way in which folks external of a company can get their points across with respect to an upcoming annual meeting. It's honestly been the thorn on the side of a lot of our clients and companies for quite a number of years, the way that it's been leveraged. This past year was no different. I think that there were these woke path kind of notice filings that were submitted by interested investors at both Tesla and Exxon. Here, this is going to be a very interesting point of evolution, because this is an area where a lot of companies have been quite upset about the use of this rule. And just this past week, Commissioner Peirce of the SEC, she gave the speech where she was very clear that these are her own views and not the views of others. But she started talking about the use of 14A proposals more generally. But the staff itself did issue guidance trying to roll back some of these protections. In particular, the guidance indicates that in order for these voluntary filers to be able to use this rule, they actually have to solicit beyond just the filing of the document with the SEC. And so that hopefully will act as a little bit of a guardrail, but it's too early to say. So we're going to see where we are with that kind of in the coming months.
Thanks, Karen. I think now might be an appropriate time to ask. We've had another audience question about civil rights audits and whether that might be an effective way to, you've mentioned talking to shareholder activists, whether that might be a way to, in some cases, stem proposals, satisfy claim, sort of concerns that certain shareholders might be bringing.
I'm happy to talk about it, or Leah, I'm happy for you to take the first crack at it. It's up to you.
You start, Karen.
Sure. So civil rights audits were actually a fairly popular proposal, not this past year, but in the years leading up to it. And what was surprising, or not surprising, but it was interesting at the time that they actually got a fair amount of traction, such that a number of companies came out proactively and indicated that they were going to, listen to shareholders and take these civil rights audits under consideration. And so you did see a number of very large public companies either capitulate and engage and decide to, do them themselves voluntarily, and or they did it in the face of a proposal that actually got a fair amount of traction. In recent years, in the last year or so, similar to some of the trends that Leah described earlier, support for those proposals has declined dramatically. Whereas a couple of years ago, I would advise a client that the likelihood of success would be fairly high, at least, kind of inching around the 40-50% mark. Now I feel very comfortable that those proposals are, not going to get a lot of traction. So I think with respect to that specific question on the civil rights audits, I think that I am aware of some proposals that are still out there asking for it. I don't think that they'll get a lot of traction. I think that companies will probably in this day and age look to fight back and probably push back. And so, there's that element. I think that there's also a secondary consideration that I know companies have raised is, the utility of these audits at the end of the day. There wasn't a lot of specificity surrounding it. It seemed as though kind of various groups were marketing their services. And so I think that the utility of the audits is somewhat, called into question. But I think that it would be surprising for companies to voluntarily do that in this environment. I think that the likelihood of success of these proposals is going to diminish further from even where they were a year ago, and that was under another administration. So I'm not sure if that's going to be the solution at the end of the day. I'm not sure if Leah, if you have other thoughts or differing thoughts from mine.
I don't disagree with you, Karen. I was just looking up the kind of average support last year was around between 15 and 20% for these types of proposals. I would expect that to be even lower this year, just given the climate and kind of where the current focus is. It's, as Karen said, it's still a tool that some investors are looking toward, and I have seen some of those proposals filed, but I wouldn't expect this to be the year when racial equity audit proposals take off.
I agree.
Great, thank you. Well, given where we are in the time of year, we're at the point where many fiscal year-end companies' deadlines for their Rule 14A shareholder proposals have passed, and companies are now grappling with how to navigate the SEC's no action review process that I mentioned earlier. Can you talk about what you're seeing in the market?
Sure. And so here it may be helpful to give a little bit of background in terms of what's happened over the last couple of years, because it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride. And so I would say that the start of this roller coaster ride was back in 2021. At that time, the SEC staff rescinded a number of existing guidance in the form of staff legal bulletins. And after the rescission of those, pieces of guidance, the SEC staff's approach to no action letters shifted quite dramatically. I think that there was a significant drop in terms of their support of issuers' request to exclude proposals. And, and that was in 2022. So after the guidance change in 21, the 22 proxy season was, a dramatic shift, whereas before you would have majority of the no action letters would receive some level of support from the SEC staff. It went down to, I think, 20 to 30%. So it was very, very jarring. In light of that shift, I think issuers got burned. They got scared about their prospects of putting in a lot of time, effort, and energy into preparing these letters. And so the next year in 23, there was actually a significant drop in no action submissions because folks were just unclear as to how the process was going to work going forward. And, kind of interestingly, in 23, there was a little bit of an uptick in terms of SEC support for the no action relief as well. So it's been kind of on and off over the last couple of years. 24, I would say, characterizes kind of a return to a more normalized experience. I think that what we experienced in 24 really kind of reflected what we experienced back in 2020 in terms of SEC support for no action letters. I think that the SEC staffs approved or aligned or supported about 70% of the no action letter submissions that were submitted. Companies this past year were much more bullish on submitting proposals under a variety of exclusions. The easiest ones obviously relate to procedural exclusions if someone missed a deadline or didn't have the appropriate ownership threshold or the appropriate ownership verification. Those are all kind of easy grounds, but companies actually expanded the universe. You saw, as I mentioned before, companies were able to exclude proposals based on violation of state law. We saw one this year where a proposal was excluded because it questioned the director's competence. Those are all kind of very interesting, more esoteric grounds for exclusion. And then you have the typical more substantive grounds being reflected, including ordinary business, micromanagement, and substantial implementation. So in terms of where we are, LizAnn, you're absolutely right that we are kind of at the very beginning of the cycle. We're starting to see some of these no action letters come through. So far, I don't think there has been a dramatic sea change. The SEC staff recently indicated that a company that received one of these director resignation proposals that was reframed from a bylaw revision to a corporate governance change, even though there was a local counsel was able to give an opinion indicating that the proposal would actually violate state law, the SEC still sided with the proponent, and so the company is being required to include it. So that still indicates that there's still perhaps some resistance to just wholesale allowing companies to exclude. But that's it's early days. And I referenced earlier in my other remarks regarding some commentary that Commissioner Peirce made, and she was very specific on how the SEC staff has managed this process over the last couple of years and indicating her displeasure with the way that the 14.8 rules have evolved over time. I think that she's suggesting that there should be a second look at the ownership guidelines and also just the way that the SEC is approaching the exclusion. It was interesting in terms of her view because she kind of just talked about the proposals in different buckets, proposals that were more traditional, that really got to the core of shareholder value, such as staggered boards and poison pill versus more the flavors related to sustainability and ESG. And so those are some of the things that we're seeing kind of in the markets as we develop.
Yeah, and I would just note, we've certainly seen suggestions that the 14.8 level should be raised, the number of shares, the dollar value of the shares that a proponent has to hold in order to file a proposal, the length of time that they have to hold those shares. Lots of suggestion that the process needs some changes, I think in part in reaction to the massive growth in the number of proposals that have been filed over the last couple of years. Maybe one other element I would mention, and this was somewhat notable activity during 2024, was what happened with Exxon and the Follow This Arjuna Capital proposal that they had received. So those two groups, Follow This and Arjuna Capital, had submitted a shareholder proposal at Exxon asking Exxon to accelerate their reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in the medium term, and also to disclose new plans, targets, and timetables around their greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Rather than seeking no action relief, Exxon filed suit against those investors seeking to have the court exclude the proposal, rather than kind of go through that normal no action process that Karen was referring to. The shareholders withdrew the proposal pretty quickly after that suit was filed. The suit continued. Exxon at the time decided, even though you've withdrawn the proposal, we want to continue with the lawsuit. And it resulted in eventually Arjuna Capital agreeing to never file a similar proposal in the future. And that was the basis upon which that suit was eventually dismissed. So there was all of this kind of played out during spring and early summer last year. And there was, I think, at least some view that this would have a chilling effect on the number of proposals that would be filed this year. And again, whether those proposals were getting to a level of granularity that companies would find objectionable. I think, Karen, interested in your thoughts on this as well, just reviewing many of the proposals that we've already seen this season. We don't have a good sense of the numbers yet, so it's hard to say if the number is dropping off. I think we're continuing to see proposals that are quite granular in what they're asking for.
I agree.
So this idea of like the complete chilling effect of we won't see any of these types of proposals anymore, that I think that certainly has not borne out.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that it's a great point for you to raise the Exxon Arjuna Capital situation, in part because Exxon got a lot of negative, media attention by virtue of taking this step. I think there were a number of articles written and a number of supporters of Arjuna that felt as though Exxon had gone perhaps a step too far as it relates to, litigating and also continuing to litigate even after Arjuna had withdrawn the proposal. But, I think to your point, we had thought that maybe there would be more of a chilling effect, but I haven't necessarily seen that today, in part maybe because there's a sense that what Exxon did was probably not going to be replicated elsewhere. The companies were not necessarily going to pull out the big guns. And I would also say that my recollection of that situation was that, there had been a number of years of engagement between Arjuna and Exxon that led to that point. It wasn't like kind of a one-shot situation. And Exxon did, in fact, in prior years, have a lot of various proposals kind of from Arjuna included. So yeah, I think that was a result of a long standing, debate.
Thanks. And Karen or Leah, is there anything more you would like to say about sort of the exclusion of proposals because it involves micromanagement or, a sort of too much detail in the company's approach to certain topics?
Sure, I can talk at a high level about it, just about that process. And so the Rule 14A process is very interesting. As Leah alluded to, there are certain procedural elements pursuant to which someone can submit a proposal. You need to meet certain ownership thresholds. You need to meet a certain deadline. The proposal itself can't pass a certain word limitation. And so there are a lot of things that you need to be worried about to make sure that the company is at all able to include the proposal in the proxy statement. But on top of that, the SEC has provided a number of substantive grounds for exclusion. And that's really where the SEC is kind of getting into the weeds when we have the no action letter process. And so, as I mentioned before, one of the grounds relates to violation of state law. That is, if a proposal, if implemented, would violate state law. There's this other concept of ordinary business or micromanagement. And historically, the SEC has sided with companies when they've looked at a proposal and said, hey, this proposal is getting far too in the weeds on the company and its operations. It doesn't really have anything to do with kind of a broader issue that impacts shareholders at writ large. And so on that basis, the SEC historically has been quite amenable to allowing companies to exclude. But I think this is all a matter of, there are no hard and fast rules. There's no bright line test. And honestly, the SEC staff has shifted its views over time. And so it's one of those things where we kind of look at every season, we look at the prior year and the year before and say, is this a type of proposal that the SEC historically has permitted to go through, or have they allowed for exclusion? And unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of consistency. There are some years in which we've seen, the SEC take one position and then with the exact same proposal, take a different position in the following year. So I think one of the things that we're all looking for with kind of the new administration is maybe a little bit more stability as it relates to how companies can really react and behave in light of this kind of this whiplash approach on proposals.
Thanks, Karen. And this is probably a good time to segue into some of the examples of proposals that you're seeing this year and that might be top of mind for shareholders at this point.
So we obviously cover a number of different companies and have access and are seeing some things in the market more generally. One of the developments last year related to an uptick in AI proposals. And I think we're going to see more of those for this upcoming year. And they're in all different flavors and varieties. The ones I've seen have asked for transparency reports. I think that folks are interested in governance procedures surrounding AI, as well as the board's role in overseeing AI usage. And so I think that will be something of a keen interest this year. And we'll see, to what extent shareholders support these types of proposals. Similarly, I think that we are seeing also governance proposals come through, similar to ones in the past. Shareholders' ability to act by written consent to the extent that a company does not already provide that. Those are typical kind of, garden variety proposals that we're seeing. We're also seeing proposals related to shareholders' ability to call a special meeting. I know that John Chevedden is targeting very specific elements of that, as there are some companies out there that have a 1-year holding requirement associated with a special meeting right. And I think he's looking to kind of dismantle some of those very, very technical provisions. So I think that's an interesting development. On the compensation side, one of the proposals that has gotten some level of traction in prior years and is still out there is the severance proposal, whereby the proposal seeks for there to be a cap on severance or termination payments of up to 2.99 times an executive's base salary and short-term incentive payments. And so that's kind of an interesting proposal that actually has gotten, in various years, some level of support. So that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And I think Leah, referenced before, there's a combination of both ESG, pro ESG and anti-ESG proposals. And I'm seeing that on mine. And I think that Leah's seeing it on hers. I'm seeing civil rights audit proposals, climate transition plan proposals. And then on the flip side, I have anti-ESG proposals that are looking for full dismantlement of DEI programs. I saw a proposal recently focused on religious gift matching. The idea there is that the company is actually required to, the proposal asks for the company to prepare a report identifying risks associated with excluding religious organization giving from their match programs. And so lots of variations. I'm sure you're seeing many more as I am as well.
Yeah, a couple others I would mention. You talked a little bit about union. I've seen proposals asking companies to adopt union neutrality provisions and policies at the company. We're also seeing proposals around human rights and supply chain issues. And then I mentioned earlier, or in the environmental space, certainly still a focus on climate, but I think we're also seeing a number of other proposals on related areas, including plastics and packaging issues, particularly for consumer-facing companies, and a little bit more focus on that critical minerals topic than I've seen in the past. More proposals asking companies to take a position on whether they will or will not mine for critical minerals in certain parts of the world.
Great. Circling back to something, Leah, that you said earlier on climate, and I think is echoed in Karen's remarks about the fact that some of the decline in proposals is coming from the fact that there will be mandatory reporting on some of these topics, or that companies are voluntarily providing more information. What should companies be thinking about now to get ready for that in terms of preparing to make mandatory climate disclosures if that's going to be required for them under the California or the European rules? And how do you think that's going to play into sort of the proxy process overall?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a sense that shareholders won't have to keep asking for things once they're available. Just to kind of double click on what these requirements are and who they will apply to. And as I said, we're within the first reporting period. So now is the time when people and companies need to kind of start collecting the information that they will be required to report. So the California laws, and there's a lot of kind of open questions around how these laws apply and who they apply to. But essentially what the statutes say is that they apply to, as I mentioned, public and private entities that are doing business in California. And explain why I put that in quotation marks in a second. That have minimum global revenue of at least $1 billion. That's the trigger for reporting on your scope 1 and 2 emissions in the first year, and then your scope 3 emissions in the following years after that. Lots of questions around how to actually interpret this law. It requires rulemaking from the California Air Resources Board, known as CARB. You're working on that process right now and expect regulations to be out by July 1st. For those of you keeping track of where we are within the calendar, of course, we're within 2025, and July 1st is halfway through the first reporting period. So certainly some challenges for companies with the idea that you won't exactly know what you have to report and what the basis for reporting that is until you're halfway through the first reporting period. Certainly creating some difficulty for companies thinking about compliance. CARB is, as I said, within the rulemaking process right now. They do have a request out to all stakeholders and companies asking for feedback on a number of questions that they've published in terms of, questions that will help them with the rulemaking process. Which companies should this apply to? What definition of doing business should they use? What's the touch point to California that's appropriate to be pulled into scope of this law? So, the early questions here still kind of remain to be seen in terms of what the details will require. But for any companies that think that they might be in scope, if your revenue number is over $1 billion, if you have essentially any touch points to California, I would certainly circle up with your legal counsel, get a view on whether you're likely to be in scope or not. And if so, make sure that you have the processes in place to feel ready at some point early next year to report on your scope 1 and 2 emissions. Lots of companies are already doing this, gathering this information, reporting on the data, or just gathering and being ready internally. I'll tell you, Simpson Thacher itself will be in scope of this law. So our law firm is in the process of getting ready to comply as well. That just kind of underlines the point, the broad nature of the types of companies and entities that will be in scope of the reporting here. It even applies to nonprofits, for example. So it will have very broad application.
That's great. Thanks, Leah. And in terms of, could you provide just a quick one sentence for folks who might not be familiar with what scope 1 and scope 2 might mean as opposed to scope 3?
Oh, everyone doesn't think about scope 1, 2, and 3 all day long like I do. So this is kind of a way of trifurcating the types of emissions that are associated with a company. So scope 1 emissions are emissions that your owned property creates. Lots of companies don't have any scope 1 emissions. Simpson Thacher, the law firm, does not have any types of, plants that we're running, or, we don't have cars that we're driving around that belong to the company. That kind of is what falls into the scope 1 emissions. And so those emissions are largely related to companies that have like manufacturing facilities, for example. Scope 2 emissions are emissions that are burned sort of on your behalf. And this picks up things like the emissions associated with the energy used to heat and cool your buildings. This is for many companies, their scope 2 numbers are much greater than their scope 1 numbers. Scope 3 emissions relate to kind of up and down your value chain and looking holistically at the operations of the company. What are the emissions associated with the company? There are a number of different categories here, but this picks up things like business travel. To the extent that your employees are getting on airplanes and flying around the world on behalf of your company, those emissions are associated with the company through scope 3. Use of your sold products. So say you're a widget maker, you would have emissions associated with the actual manufacturing of the widget. But there would also be emissions associated with the using of that widget. Say your widget is an air conditioning machine, for example. Once those air conditioners are in place at a consumer, what are the emissions associated with the use of that product through its life? So that's the kind of way that we think about this is the scope 3, and the reason why people focus on that is being so challenging is that it is looking very holistically at how products are used, the life cycle of products. It also includes the extent to which you're financing emissions. So for example, for a large financial institution, their scope 3 emissions includes projects that they underwrite and the emissions associated with those projects. So the numbers can be extremely hard to calculate. It requires a great deal of kind of assumptions and understanding the business models to come up with the appropriate figures. And that's why there tends to be a lot more concern about the reliability of those numbers and the difficulty that's coming up with the right estimates.
Thanks. It sounds like companies should start thinking about now. Gathering that seems like it will be a challenge in a whole year, let alone half a year. So hopefully, folks, I like your advice. Call your law firms early and often on this one to get a framework in place. With that, we've got only a few minutes left, and I think top of mind for a lot of people beyond Rule 14A proposals, might be some areas we've touched on, personal security and the like. So I'll open that up. Karen, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so personal security, I think it's going to be not necessarily part of 14A, but part of the proxy statement process more generally. And just to give some background here, as you noted at the very beginning, the proxy statements include a great deal of executive compensation related disclosures. Historically, the SEC has required companies to make disclosure regarding executive perquisites. And, historically, the SEC has also indicated that personal security provided to executives is deemed to be a perquisite in their eyes, notwithstanding that they've historically defined perquisites to mean any sort of, personal benefit that is directly and integrally related to, that is not directly and integrally related to the performance of an executive's duties. And so there's always been a bit of a tension there. I think a lot of companies have historically taken a position that, when they provide personal security benefits to their executives, it's for a good reason. It's for the for the executive to do their job, but by virtue of the SEC's very, very stark kind of bright line view as to how personal security is treated, they've had to identify and typically quantify those amounts included in the proxy statement. And so as a result of the horrific United Healthcare executive murder earlier, a lot of companies have been rethinking their security measures more broadly. I think there's been a lot of internal discussions regarding, providing more security. And by virtue of that, there's also a focus on what this means for the proxy disclosure. Because these numbers have always been included as part of an executive's overall compensation package, they have the appearance of kind of making that number a great deal larger, even though the companies themselves are taking the position that this is actually necessary for the executive to do their job. And I think there's also the secondary concern that because of the SEC's disclosure mandate of providing detail relating to these perquisites, it could in the future provide a roadmap for other threat actors to kind of react and to kind of scope out the executives and who may be more vulnerable. So this is definitely an area of a lot of focus currently. I think that companies will be pushing back quite significantly on the SEC's position. It's possible that the staff comes out with guidance, but I also think that it's possible that the companies will just take a more aggressive view on it and basically take the position that these benefits are not really perquisites, and it will be kind of more explicit about that and kind of in the face of the SEC's guidance. And so it's a very interesting, kind of a scary topic. I definitely think that the nuances today are very different. One of the things that I've been telling my clients, or at least talking through, is the fact that these rules were drafted, frankly, at a different time. I think that nowadays you're seeing doxing of executives. I think that the threats are actually real and imminent. The threats, from my perspective and my experience, have escalated, have gotten quite a bit more intense. And so accordingly, to me, it does make sense for companies and frankly, the SEC to kind of think a little bit more about this particular topic.
Thanks, Karen. Leah, anything that you want to add?
I would just kind of note that it's amazing how one really notable activity and really a huge tragedy could very much impact corporate practices in a number of ways, and the way that people have been looking at the spend on corporate security and for its executives. I think that people will start to change the way that they looked at that. It felt like almost gratuitous spending in the past, and it certainly will not be viewed that way now. Yeah. Of what happened late last year.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing that I'll be interested to see what happens is that historically, I think, the proxy advisory firms, we talked a little bit maybe at the very beginning about it. You've got ISS and Glass Lewis. These are the groups that advise shareholders and especially large shareholders as to how to vote their shares. They've historically, been skeptical, somewhat cynical about the provision of personal security. I think that they have felt as though those numbers have been quite large in some cases. I'd be interested to see how their practices change. I think that they're going to be a little bit more viewed as perhaps tone deaf. They're not actually, seeing what is happening in the market more generally. I think it's going to be, if they continue to push back on it and highlight it as a significant, from their mind, gratuitous expenditure, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also think we're seeing a shift, at least in discussions at companies. There was so much focus on cyber and cybersecurity, and we're seeing a much more holistic look at security among the C-suite and more broadly. So anyway, with that, thank you so much for your time. We're at 1 o'clock, and I really appreciate it. Karen, Leah, your insights have been incredibly valuable, and I hope we'll see you and folks in the audience at our board forum on March 26th and 27th in New York City. Thank you very much. And with that, we'll wrap things up.
Thanks.